The following is an unrehearsed interview with Professor Harold Bloom of Yale University for the Robert Penn Warren Oral History Project of the University of Kentucky Library. The interview was conducted by Susan Allen in New Haven, Connecticut on May 5, 1980 at 10 o'clock a.m.
Professor Bloom, could we begin by your telling me the circumstances of your first acquaintance with Robert Penn Warren?
Oh, I don't think I can really remember them across so many years. Red was a professor in the English department, but not much involved in the center of it, since he never would teach graduate courses, if I remember properly. And he usually taught undergraduate writing courses, which weren't much my concern. I was a junior member of the department from 1955 or so on, and I don't remember when I first met Red.
Was it at Yale?
Oh, sure, it was at Yale, but I don't think, we weren't in any way particularly close at all. I mean, we had some good friends in common, like R.W.B. Lewis and Bill Wimsett and some other people on the faculty. But in fact, my first memory of a conversation with Red, which he and I have chuckled about because he remembered it also, was on the whole not a very friendly conversation. It was a sort of ideological dispute. It must have taken place around 1962 or 63, and I don't remember whose house it was at, but we were both guests at some sort of a party or a function, and I had heard him remarking that he had built his house down in Reading, I guess it must be.
Yes.
I don't think it was the Vermont one, pretty much from scratch. And I made some naive, I think we had never really had a conversation before, though we must have been introduced. I made some naive, perfectly amiable and innocent remark, not intended to be ideological. That was kind of nice because you could then sort of build the house according to your heart's desires. At which he suddenly flashed out with a remark that was a pretty innocent statement. He said, to believe you could ever do anything according to the heart's desires, because there was, after all, such a thing as original depravity, and people who saw things the way I saw them just could not take such things into account. I remember being quite put off by his remark, which I felt was unusually severe for so innocent a provocation, and it sort of darkened my ideological suspicions of him, since I felt that I came out of very different traditions, including very different traditions of American literature and thought than Red did. And in those days, 1962, 63, what I knew of his poetry, which would have been, his poetry up to that time, didn't greatly move me. I admired the early novels, but not those maybe he was moving into.
Are you speaking of Knight Rider and some of the very early ones?
Yeah, I still think that Red's four good novels are At Heaven's Gate, Knight Rider, All the King's Men, and World Enough in Time, and I'm not really happy about his fiction since. But in any case, his poetry, what year was Incarnations? 1966?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, his poetry had not yet undergone the change which I found so fascinating. So there wasn't any more contact between us after that. I mean, I thought, well, he is a man of great talent, but somebody who is ideologically unpalatable to me, and I don't know what he thought, probably that I was an aggressive young man of the neo-romantic persuasion.
Did you discover upon the development of your acquaintance any particular literary fundamental literary disparities, which were perhaps the subject of your conversations.
Well, that came later after we became friends. I mean, I rose up here as an enemy of the new critics, of Brooks, of Warren, of my own teacher, Bill Wimsatt, of professors like Mack and Martz. I mean, an ideological and intellectual enemy, I hope not a personal enemy.
Would you care to specify that just slightly?
Yeah, I was a kind of romantic revivalist. I mean, the poetry I cared for did not seem to me the poetry that they cared for. What they stood for educationally struck me as being not what I stood for educationally. There were vast religious, social, political, but ultimately cultural differences between us, and a clash of traditions. And I was a somewhat polemical young man. I was not the tired old fellow I am now. And Red has always been pretty fierce. And back around 1962, 63, when that contact took place, let's see, I was 32 or 33 then. So Red was about 57, 58, I guess, at that point. In any case, the real change in his poetry came as he turned 60. And I remember reading the volume Incarnations and being terribly moved and feeling that for the first time he was a very considerable poet indeed, and that was confirmed for me by reading Audubon, but we still weren't in any contact. I think what happened was that in 1972 or so, on a sudden impulse, when I had a first copy of a small critical book I had written, which sort of changed my own work, called The Anxiety of Influence.
Yes.
I sent it to Red, and to my astonishment, around January 1973 or so, I got some very moving and enthusiastic letters from him about it, and a very moving phone call from him. And I think he invited me to lunch or dinner and showed me the poems he was writing then in 1973, which pretty much became the poems that made up the volume, Or Else.
I see.
And I'm pretty sure that was the volume.
Did he begin sending you his work after that, perhaps, for you to look over?
No, we looked at some of those poems together, and I was quite astonished. I still remember, I think, though I may have the date wrong on this, but one of them may have been the astonishing poem that I wrote about in the book called A Map of Misreading, The Sunset Walk in Thought Time in Vermont, which instantly captured me. And he then just quietly set up a practice, which I guess we have followed pretty rigorously for the last 7 years or so, of sending me his poems as he writes them, and we've corresponded about them extensively, and I guess we've met scores of times through those 7 years for lunch to talk over the poems. I mean, we've talked about other things, but basically we have argued the poems and the kind of poems they were and the way his poetry was moving, and I have followed the development of that poetry very closely now for the last 7 years, and I've reviewed each volume in turn as it's come out. And I've written, though I have not published and have not been in a mood to publish, a kind of long commentary essay on the whole development of his poetry. But I keep going back to it, and I guess in a year or two I'll be ready to go through it and see just how extensive it is and what I want to do with it.
Well, we'll look forward to that.
Yeah.
In other words, perhaps you've moved closer to Warren's poetry and further away from his fiction, would you say?
Well, we've had a couple of discussions about that, and we're both a little gingerly about it. He's very fond of a place to come to. I guess I'm not. It does seem to me that from 1966 on, the poetry has gotten more impressive every year now for 14 years. a development strikingly like, say, the development of Stevens's poetry from parts of a world on to the end, you know. In the last 25 years or so of Stevens's life, I think the poetry did get better every year. These last 14 years of Red, and you know, one wants him to have many, many years, decades if possible to come. He's been doing the same. But it does seem to me that the fiction has fallen away after the first 4 published novels, and that the poetry has in some way taken its place. And in any case, whether or not I'm right about that surmise, or whether or not I undervalue a novel like A Place to Come To, I don't think that any serious critic at this time would say that Red's fiction of the last 14 years is anywhere near as impressive as his poetry of the last 14 years, aesthetically speaking, or spiritually speaking, or just in terms of its power of style.
Okay. Have you by any chance bickered over Emerson?
Oh, sure. I mean, I mean, it's half humorous by now, but I mean, we periodically come back to that. I mean, it's all been very good-natured in these last 7 years that we have been friends. I have a great veneration for Warren, of course, and an enormous astonishment and veneration for the movement of the poetry. I mean, since the death of Stevens, that I'm convinced is the finest poetry we have had in this country. Indeed,
Really?
You know, or the finest poetry available in English. And Stevens died, after all, a quarter of a century ago. I think it's, you know, there have been, in my generation, there are many remarkable poets: John Ashbery, James Merrill, Archie Ammons, John Hollander, the late James Wright, Bill Merwin in his best work, and so on. And there was Miss Bishop in the generation between my generation and Red. But for work, you know, of the really major dimension in the old high style, for a kind of poetry of the sublime, there isn't really anything, it seems to me, between late Stevens and late Warren. But yeah, we do not exactly agree about Ralph Waldo Emerson.
I wonder if you would consider this question. Warren may possibly have gotten from John Crowe Ransom this fury against abstractionism that so characterized Ransom's perspective.
Yeah.
Do you feel this is part of Warren's objection to Emerson? Does he perhaps object a bit to the abstract element, or is it far more complex than that?
Oh, I dare say that is to say, what he would, I would say, mistakenly regard as a kind of abstractionism in Emerson. It certainly gets into that sequence of poems, Homage to Emerson, with its ironical title, On Night Flight to New York. But no, I think it is a very grave and complex and enormous disagreement, which would be at the heart of Warren's work, or at the heart of the people Warren was first associated with, including Ransom and Tate, and in a way the sort of spiritual preceptorship of T.S. Eliot. But it's an enormous quarrel which goes to the roots of American culture, the roots of American religion, and above all else, you know, seems to me at the very heart of American literature. It goes back to the deep split that takes place in Emerson's own time and after. And I would firmly believe you could divide our major writers into those who are positively influenced by Emerson and those who are negatively influenced by Emerson. I mean, Whitman, Dickinson, Thoreau, and many others are positively influenced by Emerson. Hawthorne, overwhelmingly, I suppose. Melville, to some extent, Henry James, are just as powerfully influenced by Emerson as I think they realize, but they're moved to protest, to shock, to arguing. Or Poe is another instance, though I wouldn't say that Poe was influenced by Emerson, whereas clearly in their very different ways, Hawthorne and Melville and even Henry James strongly were. Red is the heir of a tradition, which would certainly include Hawthorne and Melville at the heart of it. His poetry has, as he knows and has shown, a deep affinity to Melville's poetry. And
How would you describe Warren's poetic aesthetic? Does he mythologize the South to any extent that could be termed romantic, or do you think his poetry partakes of something else altogether?
no, I don't think it partakes of something else altogether. I mean, it's a kind of anti-romantic romanticism of the American kind, but that doesn't make it any less romantic, say, than Wallace Stevens or even Hart Crane.
I would be fascinated to have you go into that just a little.
I mean, the mythologizing in Red's poetry about himself as person and his stance as a poet is a kind of mythology of depersonalization. But I think it comes down, you know, in the end, not to anything explicit in the way of theology. I mean, I haven't the least idea myself what Red's religion in any formal sense by now is or is not. But it is obviously a powerfully theological poetry. It would appear to be a very personal theology, but certainly a very severe one, based on a very dark image indeed of God as a kind of severe moral judgment.
Do you think this has something to do with Southern history?
Oh, well, it must have an enormous amount to do with Southern history, but I can't be wholly sure of that. I mean, it's very puzzling to me, the whole question of the extent to which Southern poets are necessarily more or less trapped in a regional history or a cultural history than, you know, strong poets from elsewhere in the country.
Warren has an essay on literary regionalism,
Yeah, I
in
know
which he makes some very strong assertions about, in some don'ts for literary regionalists, about the fallacies inherent in regional writing.
Sure,
And he
sure.
asserts very strongly that regional writing is, first of all, demands reality and experience, and that it's no substitute for anything else, and that it doesn't imply a relaxing of critical standards. He's quite defensive about Southern writing as such.
That's way back, that essay, though, isn't it?
Yes. I think he's also a little hard on the critics of Southern writing, and I think he tends to have a great deal of affirmation in his interpretation of history, that the things to be learned from history.
Yeah, I'm not sure, you know, that the poetry of the last 15 years strikes me as being quintessentially Southern in any way. I don't even think it has much to do with where you're living or what overt viewpoint you've adopted. Not that Red's stances or viewpoints are ever questions of the surface anyway, but you know, I think of a poet, you know, whose work I know well and whom I also know well as a person and like enormously as a person, like Archie Ammons. Archie's up there in the snow country in upstate New York, and except for a year back at Wake Forest, I wouldn't think that Archie has been back in the deep South for a hell of a long time, but Archie seems to me unmistakably a Southern poet in everything that he writes, and yet the ideology of what he's writing is a kind of high and desperate transcendentalism, and I think he's the most purely Emersonian poet in American literature, you know, of real stature, since Whitman himself. So look at that paradox. I mean, you've got an Emersonian poet in every way, more inescapably Southern in language, in stance, in obsession, in drive than Red is. And
Do you feel
I just don't see how you can associate ideology or a kind of implicit theology or spirituality of a poetic stance with regionalism of any kind. I just don't see that is much help at all.
Do you think perhaps that Warren has grown away from this framework of a historical tradition and maybe perhaps is establishing a poetic tradition of his own?
Well, he wouldn't himself, I suspect, want to hear you or myself say that, but a poet who is as obsessed with history as Red is, especially if he is as strong and really violent in imagination. I mean, an amazingly violent imagination.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not sure that there has been in the poetry of this century, except for Hart Crane, a more violent imagination than Red's. Stevens talks about the imagination as being a violence from within, confronting a violence from without, but Stevens is a perpetually modulated imagination, an imagination deeply invested in nuance of the subtlest kinds. Red is a very subtle poet, but it really does seem to me that the principal stigma of his poetic language and of his poetic stance is real extremism, is real violence of vision, is indeed that high mode of the abyss or the sublime. I think a poet with a temperament like that, a really violent temperament, courteous and charming and remarkable a personality, and as urbane a character as the man is, but the poet is very fierce, absolutely uncompromising. I think that such a poet or such a poetic mind is of necessity so idiosyncratic that what it calls history is just not what you or I would call history, and just has very little relation to our notions of history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what it calls history, I think you or I have got to regard as a trope or as a way of figurating experience into language, and I just don't find that the specific burden of Southern history has much to do with it.
You feel any traditions have been totally transmuted then in his
Yeah,
work?
by a vision so idiosyncratic and by an intelligence so comprehensive and so subtle that I hardly know that anything but confusion is achieved by trying to describe that poet
How would
as
you
being Southern.
how would you characterize his latest poetry of most recent years?
Oh, that is very remarkable and very difficult, as the forthcoming volume will show. The one that he's just said on the telephone, I can hope to have an advance copy of shortly. The 75th birthday volume. I mean, what struck me overwhelmingly. Let's see. This is Since Now and Then, isn't it?
Now and Then is the new
Now
one.
and Then is the last volume.
Yes, and the new
And
one
Now
is,
and Then was published 2 years ago,
right.
wasn't it? Now and Then is really the last stand of that style that Red was sort of working out in Or Else, which carries through all the new poems in the last selected poems and really does culminate in, what's that extraordinary poem? A little tired this morning. Heart of Autumn. Isn't that
Yes,
in Now
yes.
and Then?
Uh-huh.
Heart of Autumn, and there's that other poem in Now and Then, a really great poem, Red Tail Hawk,
Right.
Empire of Youth. That poem and Heart of Autumn seemed to me the absolute culmination of the poetry that Red started to write in 1966 with a poem like The Leaf, and which goes right through Incarnations, Audubon, Or Else, the new poems and the selected poems. And
What do you feel is really at work in Heart of Autumn?
I think it is the kind of saying farewell to, though he may not have known it at the time, that style he'd been working out for a dozen years and more, And it's very striking that at about the age of 73, 2 years ago, you could see in the poems he wrote after Now and Then was already in the production process, in proof and so on, that the poetry was changing again. And the new volume seems to me to be divided about evenly between poems in that mode, which does culminate in Now and something very different, which I find very hard to describe. And I'd have to get hold of the new book and have a chance to really let it work at me. But about half the poems in it are in a very different mode, not in that tremendously high-pitched, powerfully impacted, at its worst, somewhat convoluted, at its best, really austere style.
Do you feel, perhaps to oversimplify, that his poetry has mellowed considerably in recent times?
There is, I don't know if mellowing is the right word. There's something uncanny going on again. He's a mellow and charming human being, as anyone who has the privilege of knowing him comes to see very quickly. But I think it is the virtue of his poetry that it never will mellow. No, I don't find any mellowing in this poetry of the last year and a half or 2 years. I find certainly greater simplicity, a kind of austere clairvoyance, a kind of different sort of difficulty, a more internalized difficulty perhaps, or yet more internalized difficulty than the work from Or Else through Now and Then. But I can't fully characterize it as yet, because while I've been reading those poems for a year and a half, I need to spend more time with them.
This phrase you use, internalized difficulty, does that have anything to do with the theme of identity?
Well, I suppose if one were to adopt a kind of Freudian point of view, which comes with modifications pretty naturally to me, but not, I think, too naturally to Red. So how applicable it is to the process of the recent poetry, I don't know. But according to a Freudian notion, as you move towards the fullest maturity, beyond the pleasure principle, you have to kind of introject the last things. You have to project or cast out what seems extraneous to you, and you have to achieve a kind of ultimate identification of yourself with the acceptance of death or of the necessity of dying, and you have to come to a full self-realization. It's curious that Freud should be so much at one with many of the Western traditions that he sought to at least modify, if not overturn. But yeah, I guess I would be willing to speak of this new phase in Red, though he certainly might not want that, as a kind of introjection or identification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As though, in my own rather strange terminology, he has to perform a last crossing, as though he has got to find out how far-ranging his identifications are and what it is that he finally wants to reject.
I see. Have you felt that the Warren in his poetry and his other writings is the same Robert Penn Warren you've known as a friend, as a person?
Well, in some ways, I've spent more time with his poetry in the last 7 years than I have spent with the man. I think we are fond of each other, but after all, he's a quarter of a century older than I am, and I have great veneration and respect for him, and I'm somewhat in awe of him. I think I know the poetry of the last, it would be nearly 15 years now, and particularly of the last 7 years, better even, much better than I know the man. I don't know really how I would answer that. I mean, I have some very close friends who are, I mean, I think of Ammons, who's of course just a couple of years older than I am. Archie was born, I think, in 1926. I was born in 1930. I haven't seen much of Archie in recent years, but I know Archie far better than I know Red. I wouldn't ever be able to bring Archie and the poetry completely together. You know, the poet as poet and the poet as man seem to me very fundamentally different categories of, I don't know what to call it, not so much existence, but...
They just operate in different spheres.
Well, the poetry is written by the ontological self, you might say. Mm-hmm. And the man who walks around is a kind of empirical self, though he has his ontological or deeper side. And it's hard to link up the two. I mean, the Warren, whom I know and of whom I'm in awe personally, is grave, and even when most informal, beautifully formal. Hi, Jean. Gentle, always courteous, formidably ironic sometimes, but...
You speak of the empirical self. Do you feel that a certain pragmatic element carries over into his poetry?
Well, I'm sure he would want to see it that way. I guess I just don't see it. I mean, even though it is peopled with so many people, even though on principle he still, I suppose, presents himself as a dramatic poet, invariably dramatizing not only his own memories, but his memories of others. I find that a kind of beautiful illusion on his part. I mean, there I think I dissent entirely from all the criticism that I see being written of Warren's poetry these days. I mean, people say of Stevens's poetry, particularly the later poetry, that maybe what's wrong with it is there hasn't got any people in it, including maybe even Stevens himself, to which no one would reply, well, that is to mistake the way in which poetry can be about anything. I mean, I don't think... I take it that poetry is a thinking by trope, by figuration, and in order to arrive at a figuration, you struggle with prior figurations. Mm-hmm. And I firmly do not believe, though this is one of the things I'm always saying, that most critics and most poets find unbearable. But I don't think Red disputes it much when we talk about it sometimes, because he's a very shrewd reader of poetry indeed, and a very shrewd theorist about poetry. Not that I'm just trying to assimilate him to my camp or my way of doing things, because there are, of course, real differences. But I think he knows, in a wonderfully pragmatic way, that if you're going to get a person, including yourself, or a place, or a thing, or an event into a poem, you can't do it without treating that person or place or thing or event in terms of what is already somehow a poem about it, or what is suggestive of a poem about it. And in order to do it, you've got to treat it as though it were already somehow a figuration or a trope. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that leaves very much of the empirical self. I think the result is that the drama of Stevens's poetry is a mostly implicit one. The drama of Warren's poetry is mostly explicit, though this recent phase the ongoing phase may change our view of that. But in the end, I find, though there's not the slightest question of an influence, there seem to me some deep and strange affinities between the Stevens of a sequence like The Rock and Warren's most recent poetry.
Do you feel, you mentioned this perhaps underlying dark religious overtone
Yeah.
in Warren's poetry. Do you think also that there are perhaps any unchanging ideals that permeate Warren's poetry, which perhaps survive any temporary changes in attitude over the years?
I guess it all depends what you mean by ideal.
I'm using a very vague sort of term.
I mean, there is a kind of, you could call it ontological or metaphysical vision, I would want to call it, of, well, a kind of anti-transcendentalism, a firm insistence upon immanence, which goes right through the work from the very beginning to the present. And I think the obsessiveness with fierce birds, particularly the hawk obsession, is the best single indication of that.
That's very
I mean, the hawk invariably stands in Warren's poetry for a kind of absolute immediacy, of imminent vision, of a indisputable instance of what Yeats means by the brute blood of the air. I suppose someday somebody ought to come along, I won't do it, and compare the hawk imagery in Yeats and the hawk imagery in Warren. I doubt that Red owes much to the hawk imagery of a Cahulan cycle play like At the Hawk's Well, but there are funny affinities between that moment in the leaf and At the Hawk's Well. Can we turn it off for a second?
You've commented on points of difference between yourself and Robert Penn Warren. Do you have any common areas of sympathy? Do you share enthusiasm for particular authors?
I'm trying to think. I think we've spent more time talking about authors about whom we disagree than about authors, we both care deeply for. I mean, we've spent a lot of time through the years debating Emerson or debating T.S. Eliot. And he's not deeply involved in any way in the poetry of Stevens or the poetry of Hart Crane or even Whitman. I think he has a lot of respect for Whitman, but not any deep affinity for Whitman's work.
Well, let me...
we talk a lot about contemporary poetry, and there, through the years, though we had some initial disagreements, it's been fascinating to me to see, as contemporary poetry develops, what a remarkable reader Red is. I remember when we started talking about Ashbery's poetry 7 years ago, Red just couldn't see it. And it certainly isn't anything I or anybody else has said or written that has changed his mind. It's just Ashbery's accomplishment as a poet. I mean, I remember specifically Red just did not know what to make of those prose 3 poems. He just didn't really see what they were doing. But if I remember properly, he greatly admired the title poem of Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. And he had a high regard for certain lyrics by Ashbery that he's read since. We like a lot of contemporary poets whom we both know, like Mark Strand and John Hollander.
Yes,
And we both like Ammons' poetry a lot. Um, but mostly we don't talk about writers. I mean, we sort of divide our time almost equally to talking about Red's poetry, since we're both very concerned with it. He is the writer of it, and myself as one of his readers, and we spend a lot of time talking about cultural dilemmas.
I beg your pardon.
Cultural dilemmas.
Oh.
The relation between tradition and or traditions and an individual writer, or the relation between past and present in general. I mean, we're both obsessed with that in very different ways, and
I see.
take rather different views of it. I see it as a much more agonistic and aggressive relationship than he sees it as being, but he knows a great deal about its agonistic and darker aspects.
How do you feel he sees it?
I think he sees it as something beyond coherence. I hope I'm not misrepresenting him. I mean, he sees that it has cooperative elements and severely competitive or agonistic elements, and I don't think he fits them together into any single pattern, because I think he would regard that as a falsification of what he calls history, or what he calls time. But of course, I do not by any means altogether understand what he calls history or he calls time, because they are in him powerful, at the least dialectical, and quite possibly self-contradictory hypostases or categories. They are composite tropes, I would say.
In Blackberry Winter, he speaks of time as a climate in which things happen.
Yeah, I don't think that is quite what he is saying in the poetry of this last decade or so. One has the notion that at certain moments in that poetry, time is anything but a climate. Time is an agent. Time is an actor, or time is an agonist even.
That's very interesting.
Certainly a menace. It's the obsessive force. I suppose I connected to that image of the hawk. Time with Warren is neither available for transcendental breakthroughs or epiphanies, nor is it continuum. It is a mode of immanence. It is a vastly complex, possibly dialectical notion.
Do you feel time is perhaps becoming a threat even?
Well, it's a field of force in him. It's I don't think it's a threat. No, I think he's too wise to put himself on the side of time. But there's a funny analog. I find this ironic, if I'm right at all, between the late Emerson, the Emerson of the Conduct of Life and afterwards, and the Warren of the recent poetry. The late Emerson is, of course, no transcendentalist. He worships fate. He worships ananke, or what he calls the sublime necessity. And he finally says that if fate takes sides against one ought to go and join fate and take sides against oneself, take the side of fate against oneself. That's a shocking and peculiar notion in the late Emerson, and one that I think Warren understands very well. I sometimes wonder whether, in this kind of vision of time as an immanent force, that's immanent, of course, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, not immanence,
Right.
whether Warren knowingly or unknowingly, and it's always very dangerous to think he does something unknowingly, because that consciousness is a very sophisticated consciousness indeed. I wonder whether Warren is not giving us an astonishing analog to the late Emerson in that regard, whether in the most recent poetry he isn't indeed intimating that instead of setting yourself against time, if time sets itself against you, then somehow, as Emerson put it, you need to throw yourself on the side of the party of the universe, or in this case the party of time, and take its side against yourself.
Excuse me.